A ring of tongues. Had it not been for that one detail, Marcus Lane's arrest would have been perfectly normal. When the police burst through his door, expecting some kind of resistance, they instead found him sitting calmly behind the desk in his study. He was wearing his best suit, was freshly showered and shaven, and was looking just as relaxed as if he were sitting in a hotel bar, waiting for his wife rather than expecting the full force of the police department. He came along quietly and willingly, all whilst wearing a wry, knowing smile. In many ways, it was one of the easiest arrests I had ever witnessed, and would have been entirely forgettable had it not been for that one detail. For before him on the desk, laying there, as if it was a perfectly ordinary thing that belonged on a desk, like a computer or a notebook, was a huge iron ring around twice the size of a dinner plate, skewered onto the ring, pierced through the roots, so that their slender tips hung down, meaty and limp like thick cylinders of purplish flesh, were 15 human tongues. In the open fireplace to his left, a pile of books were burning away to ash. That sort of detail stays with you. By the time we got him to the station, Marcus's expensive lawyer was already waiting outside. He sauntered into the cells with his head held high in a cocky, confident swagger that was infuriating to see, especially for someone like me who is charged with interviewing him. In all my years as a detective, I have never once interviewed anyone who is so unrepentant, so unruffled by the idea of serving a life sentence. Nobody who in an interview concerned with the killings of 15 separate individuals could simply sit and smirk. What could drive a man to not only kill and maim 15 others, but to surgically remove and keep their tongues? What kind of a man does that and still finds the prospect of being caught so completely undaunting? Something about the man's confidence unnerved me, but I took comfort in the fact that it was me who had brought him to justice in the first place. At the point at which I was first put onto the case, 15 mutilated corpses, all men, had been discovered at various points across the city. The only thing that linked the bodies, other than the ways in which they had been damaged, was a sample of DNA found on each. The same DNA in every case and clearly belonging to the same individual. That sample did not match anyone in the national database nor the Interpol records, suggesting that whoever had left their genetic material all over these murdered men did not have a criminal record, or at least had never given a DNA sample. What was clear, however, was that if we could find that individual and take a sample of their DNA, we would have a suspect linked to all 15 murders. The question, of course, was where and how to find them. A question it fell to me to answer. To start with, I was at a loss. I read the case files over and over, looking for a link between the men, for some clue or pattern, some detail other than their killer that linked them together. Again and again, I came up with nothing. The men were not of the same age, race, or religion. They did not share the same sexuality, have the same marital status, or mix in the same social circles. They covered a broad range of economic circumstances and all did different jobs. Based upon the evidence I had, it was doubtful that the 15 men had ever met or interacted. There seemingly was no link. It was not until a month later, sitting half drunk on the floor of my apartment at 3 a.m. and staring at the notes pinned to and covering the entire surface of one wall, that an idea finally came to me. I had already covered the usual questions of who, what, when, and had tried to answer why. What I had not considered up until that point was where. What if the locations of the murders had some significance? I stood up and, grabbing a map of the city from my desk drawer, began to plot the locations where the bodies were found onto the grids in red marker. Standing back, I looked at the points and noticed no pattern, but wondered whether the locations themselves held any significance, whether there was some landmark, some connections between the points at which the bodies had been discovered. I decided to look up each set of coordinates individually to see if there were any significant landmark or point of interest in any of them. As soon as I entered the first set of coordinates into Google, I realized I was onto something. The first few results were maps, none of which showed anything of any real note. The fourth result, however, was a quote from an online edition of one of the city's free newspapers. Opening the entry, I found that the coordinates, exactly as I had written them, appeared in the newspaper in the personal ads. The entry read, 7 p.m. Thursday night, red jacket, Andrew Moulton, 52, followed by the coordinates. The date of the paper's release was 3 days before the body of Andrew Moulton was found at those exact coordinates. Quickly, with my heart thundering in my chest, I fed in the other numbers. In every case, the numbers appeared in a personal ad. In every case, the date of publication was within 3 to 5 days of the body being discovered at that exact spot. These, I reasoned, were instructions, directions of who to kill and where. Who had sent them and who had answered the call was still unknown, but now I had an advantage. The next question was how best to use it. The following Monday, I placed my own advertisement in the paper. I gave coordinates and a description, imitating whoever was leaving the instructions and hoping to lure the killer to the spot. This time, however, the description was of a woman, me. The coordinates I gave were for a coffee shop. Rather than waiting inside for the perp to arrive, I waited, sitting in a bus stop opposite and watching through the window. Earlier that day, I had visited the coffee shop and told the cashiers that in order to facilitate an ongoing police investigation, they were to take no cash orders that day. Every transaction made must be on credit or debit card. Then I waited. In my message, I had specified the time of 7 p.m., just as 4 of the other messages had. At 7:02 p.m., I gave the signal for the fire alarm to be pulled in the cafe. I watched as every customer in the place at that moment got up and marched dutifully toward the front door, leaving their coffees behind with the promise that they could have a free one once the emergency had been dealt with. Then, once they were all safely outside, I moved in, collected every cup, the security footage from the day, and the receipts with records of every card transaction. The cups I carefully packed and sent to the lab, looking for a DNA match. Technically, I should have asked for permission, and legally I was on shaky ground. But I figured I could invent some other reason for following the killer later if I got a match, which of course I did. Once the match was confirmed, it was a case of watching the security footage and working out which customer had taken that cup, revealing who the DNA belonged to. Then I cross-referenced this to the checkout receipts. From the time of the transaction and the credit card details, I was able to get an address and a name. 2 days later, at 7 a.m. in the morning, I was watching Marcus being arrested and seeing for the first time his strange ring of human tongues. My interview with Marcus lasted less than 10 minutes, and I didn't even get to ask a question before he began talking. As soon as I pressed the button on the tape recorder, Marcus began to speak, smiling all the while like an alligator as he did. "In my country," he began, "we have old magic. Magic that you people will never understand, but which some people in your country find very useful." He paused, looking me directly in the eye and fixing his stare on me, though if he was trying to intimidate, he chose the wrong person to test his skills on. Staring straight back, I refused to lower my eyes or even to blink. Eventually, he was forced to look away. "Imagine, just for one moment," he said with hiss, "that you could know the truth of a man's soul. Know every secret that he might be hiding, every last detail that he keeps locked away from others. Depending upon who it was, that could be valuable information. Now imagine that by removing a man's tongue, piercing it with nails, and saying the correct words over it, you could make it speak the truth. Imagine that in my country there were men we called the scribes who would write with these dead men's tongues as if they were quills or pens, and would write upon the page the true answer to any question they asked. Imagine that to know a man's secrets, you need only remove his tongue. Now imagine," he said almost in a whisper, "that you knew a man who could use this magic. If you were in government, a politician, or an FBI agent, and you wanted answers from a suspect, from a spy, from a terrorist sympathizer, then you might pay that man an awful lot of money to steal those tongues and collect those secrets for you. What happened to the owner of the tongue afterward would not be your concern." "Are you saying," I asked, stunned, "that you are that man?" That the government or someone else is paying you to get those secrets from people? Nominating victims and telling you where to find them? So you can perform some ritual and write their truce with the tongues? Marcus again simply smiled. If a man like that existed, and I'm not saying that he does, he would have the highest of protections, don't you think? This little investigation would be nothing for him to worry about. That was the last thing Marcus said on tape. The following morning, 2 calls came to the station, one from a state senator, the other from the attorney general. Marcus Lane was released later that morning without charge. He has never faced any further investigation and indeed has not been heard from since. As he left the station that morning, I asked him one final question. What was in the books burning in your fireplace? He turned to me and again grinned with that hideous crocodilian smile. Secrets, he said with a laugh.